Famously, in 476, Odovaker, a general in Rome's employ but who was probably of non-Roman barbarian origin, killed the father and uncle of Romulus Augustulus, and then deposed the young emperor of the Western Roman Empire. Odovaker, with the backing of the Roman Senate, then sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, informing the imperial court there that there was no longer any reason for the Roman Empire to be divided by the rule of two emperors. One was enough, and Odovaker would govern Italy in the name of Zeno, who governed in Constantinople. Technically, the Western Empire still had an emperor, Julius Nepos, who was residing in Dalmatia, but he effectively had no power and anyway was assassinated in 480. For about 2 decades then, there was only the emperor in Constantinople. But then, starting in the 490s, the West might have got their emperor back. But this time, he wasn't Roman. Out of all of the successor kingdoms that grew up in the provinces of the Western Empire, the Ostrogothic kingdom was the one which went the farthest in self-consciously attempting to style themselves not only on the model of Rome, but as a direct continuation. At the time, this appears to have been accepted by many in Italy, especially the Italian aristocracy, the Roman Senate, and the Pope. And, although there is a divide in the historiography, there is one school of thought which argues fairly convincingly that this is probably the correct reading of our admittedly limited evidence. So what I want to do in this video is briefly examine the idea as an introduction to more content on the Ostrogoths, and in so doing, I'm drawing heavily on Jonathan Arnold's Theodoric in the Roman Imperial Restoration, James O'Donnell's The Ruin of the Roman Empire, and the relevant sections of Guy Halsell's Barbarian Migrations and the Roman West. If you want a deep dive on this subject, Arnold's book is the one you should read. So, who are the Ostrogoths? Well, they were a group of Goths who stayed behind in their homeland after the Huns entered the region in the 370s. During that period, the groups which had crossed the Danube and defeated the Roman army at Adrianople in 378 would eventually merge with other barbarian groups and coalesce into the Visigoths, sacking Rome in 410 and being settled eventually around Toulouse in the early 400s. The Ostrogoths, however, became an integral part of the Hunnic Empire, and in the process probably acquired a ruling elite which either had marriage ties with the Huns or may have been Huns themselves who took Gothic names. The specifics are not entirely clear, but what we do know of them between about 380 and about 460 is that the Ostrogoths fought under Attila, fought and lost the Battle of the Nidau in 454, a power struggle after Attila's death, and then established some sort of a kingdom in Pannonia, what is today approximately western Hungary, and some surrounding territory which comprises portions of other modern states. At some point, they acquired a ruling family by the name of Amal. We have no idea how old this family was when they start showing up in sources, and although later sources claimed a long, glorious history for them, historians are far less certain of that now than they once were. Theodoric Amal was born probably in 454, or at least around then, and he was sent to Constantinople at the age of 8 as a hostage, essentially to function as a guarantee of good conduct on the part of the Ostrogoths, who were allies of the Eastern Roman Empire at the time. While there, he was immersed in Roman culture and was given a Roman education, complete with courses in Roman law, history, Latin, and Greek. The key point here is that this barbarian was being heavily Romanized, something the Roman state often did, in order to mold hostages to their own ways of thinking, the idea being that when they hit the age of majority, they would be more useful allies. We are not sure why, but he leaves Constantinople at the age of 18, 7 years before 25, the age of majority in Roman law, and he returns to Pannonia. This is probably due to some sort of a power struggle. We know his father and his 2 uncles died sometime around 474 or 475, and Theodoric eventually became the new Ostrogothic king. The next 13 years see Theodoric leading the Ostrogoths out of Pannonia to the southern Balkans, and engaging in political games to rise to the top of the food chain after a rival, Theodoric Strabo, accidentally fell on his own spear, and Strabo's Goths were absorbed into Theodoric Amal's group, fully creating the Ostrogoths as we know them. Emperor Zeno wanted him out of the region, so the two arrived at a mutually beneficial agreement. Theodoric would lead the Ostrogoths into Italy and remove Odovaker, taking over and ruling for Zeno. This he does, and in 489 Odovacar is defeated at the Battle of Isonzo, and then the Battle of Verona. A power-sharing agreement is reached, but 4 years later, in 493, Theodoric drives a sword into Odovacar at a banquet, essentially cleaving him in half, and he now formally takes over Italy. This is where we come to the heart of the topic being explored in this video. We are not clear on what exactly Zeno was envisioning for Theodoric here outside of being a vassal of some sort, but Zeno died in 491 while Theodoric was still conquering Italy, and the new emperor, Anastasius, does something extremely intriguing. The first decade or so of Theodoric's rule are fairly murky, but in 507, he sent a letter to Anastasius which said the following: "You are the fairest ornament of all realms. You are the healthful defense of the whole world, to which all other rulers rightfully look up with reverence, because they know that there is in you something which is unlike all others. We above all, who by divine help learned in your republic the art of governing Romans with equity. Our royalty is an imitation of yours, modeled on your good purpose, a copy of the only empire. And insofar as we follow you, do we excel all other nations." Anastasius had already sent Theodoric the imperial regalia that Odovacar had sent to Constantinople after deposing Romulus Augustulus by the time Theodoric sends this letter. So what's going on here? Well, the correspondence utilizes the Latin term praeregnare, meaning something like to govern in place of or to govern instead of, the argument being that, due to the context of the original agreement struck between Theodoric and Zeno, Theodoric was dispatched to Italy having been granted the title of patrician. In the late empire this designated a high position in the Roman administration, and it's a title that Odovacar also held, while also having been declared a consul of the Roman Empire prior to leaving, something that Odovacar was not granted. Theodoric then was sent to rule Italy in the name of Zeno like Odovacar was, but the legal terminology and the cultural titles Theodoric had suggest that there was perhaps something more to it. However, after Zeno died and Anastasius took over, Theodoric appears to have begun renovating whatever this position initially was supposed to be. He began nominating members of the Roman aristocracy to the Senate and to the rank of patrician and consul, in theory something only a Roman emperor was able to do, and to all of this Anastasius apparently gave his consent. And the Italian aristocracy appears to have bought into this despite a few outliers. Although the law codes of Ostrogothic Italy did distinguish Ostrogoths from Romans, designating the former as soldiers whose task it was to defend the Roman state, Roman rights and traditions were upheld. In other words, there appears to have been no eclipse of Roman identity during Theodoric's rule. The Senate functioned as it was supposed to, and from our surviving source material on Theodoric's reign, this appears to have been accepted. The Ostrogoths collected Roman taxes and used the money to repair things like aqueducts, which had not been done in decades. The law code is really a major portion of this particular historical argument, because for the Romans, what distinguished them from barbarians in a major way was the whole conception of rule by law, especially written law, and Theodoric knew this due to his upbringing and his education by the Romans. So his attempt to utilize and uphold Roman law should be seen as an attempt to establish some kind of legitimacy among the Italian aristocracy in a manner that they would understand. In terms of foreign policy, he very much attempted to bring the successor kingdoms of the Vandals, Visigoths, Burgundians, and Franks into his orbit by marrying his daughters to the kings of those states. And when war threatened to break out between the Visigoths and the Franks, he sent a letter to Clovis, the Frankish king, essentially telling him not to do this, stating that, quote, kinship submits to itself. So why would he have gone to such lengths to have done this and maintained these relations? Well, in the line of argument that sees him as a Roman emperor, or at least something approaching it, these kingdoms were situated in the former provinces of the Roman Empire, and it was important for Theodoric to bring them under his control. Unfortunately, though, this did not work, and the Franks and the Visigoths did go to war, the end result of which was the seizure of Visigothic territory by the Franks and the absorption of the rest by the Ostrogoths, which now basically gave Theodoric a realm covering much of the Iberian and Italian peninsulas, and chunks of several other former Roman provinces. The size of the combined Ostrogothic-Visigothic realm could certainly have been used to bolster the idea of imperial continuity. Using all of these themes of continuity and diplomatic relations, Theodoric gets the Pope on board as well, and it really helps cement this idea of Theodoric as something like an emperor, and of the Ostrogothic realm as Rome reborn. Guy Halsall sums it up well when he says the following. Theodoric's political domination of the West by the middle of the second decade of the 6th century appears to have affected the presentation of his rule. He increasingly adopted a quasi-imperial style. Theodoric had not been above this type of posturing earlier in his reign, but it became more noticeable in the latter stages, and associated with a change in ideology. Theodoric increasingly emphasized his neo-imperial status. When his armies took Provence, he installed his own prefect of the Gauls, and used traditional Roman vocabulary to describe this acquisition of territory. A prefect was also installed in Spain. By 513 he seems to have encouraged the Pope to appoint the Bishop of Arles, Caesarius, as papal vicarius of all of Gaul. Caesarius visited the king in Ravenna before receiving this new title from the Pope. As early as 508, Theodoric had written to Emperor Anastasius in terms suggesting that he viewed his realm as very nearly the equal of the Eastern Empire, and certainly the only Roman state in the West. A couple of years later, a member of the senatorial Decii family erected an inscription which even referred to Theodoric as Augustus. As Theodoric's control of government became more secure, his ideology changed accordingly, claiming simply that the Goths' valor and strength justified their rule. Theodoric also minted coins, something that was a preserve strictly of the Roman emperor, and this doesn't appear, at least to our knowledge, to have been opposed by the court in Constantinople. No matter what, though, restored empire or not, the kingdom of the Ostrogoths did not last. A series of succession disputes helped to lay the groundwork for the justifications that would eventually lead to the Gothic War and the other military campaigns launched by Justinian in the 530s. It is in the context of those wars and all the suffering they produced that the Romans themselves began to fully conceptualize the idea that Rome had indeed fallen. And after 553, the idea of a restored Western Empire would have to wait for a new political player, the Franks, to revive the concept.